I wanted to start with just acknowledging the territory in which I'm coming to you from, which is Corner Brook on the west coast of the island of Newfoundland, traditional Mi'kmaq territory. And I want to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Innu, the Inuit, and the Beothuk of the land that many of us call the province of Newfoundland Labrador today. And to invite you, I know we're joining from all kinds of different places across this province and other provinces, and to invite you to reflect on the traditional territories where you might find yourself this morning or this afternoon if you're in a different time zone. But I guess you're all west of here, so if you're not here, so it's still morning. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can now see a PowerPoint. Yes, I'm seeing Nora nodding.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so I have shortened up the title to simply call it Leading Creativity. And what I thought I'd go over today is to first talk about creativity and innovation, or put another way, creativity versus innovation, to clarify what I mean by creativity and what I mean by innovation, and how I see the two as being linked. And when I say how I see it, it's not just me, but the community of researchers and practitioners that I work with and come from, how we see these interrelated. And I think that the way that I'll present it may be helpful for you as well. I'll then talk about very briefly 3 innovation types, because I think in clarifying how I see the interrelationship between creativity and innovation, I think it's also helpful to just kind of put innovation into 3 broad categories to help you think about what kind of innovation you might be working on with your organizations and with your own teams. I'll then move into 3 levels of focus, and this really becomes the heart of what I'm talking about in terms of how is it we can think about leading creativity. And if there's one thing you take away from today, I think I would like it to be this, if it's just one thing, is that leading creativity needs to be an intentional focus, an intentional activity. Creativity is not something that happens by chance. It is something that requires cultivation and intention and attention, I think, particularly from management, leadership, administrative roles. So I'll talk about creativity from an individual level, group level / team level, and a few comments on the organization level. Time depending, so I'll keep an eye on the time myself, but Nora, if you feel like you need to poke me at some point, do so. Time depending, I may also jump into some stages around creative processes, but we'll see if we get that far. So let me begin with what I mean by creativity and innovation. And I always use the metaphor of an iceberg, which is something, of course, for I think everybody here is situated on the east coast of Canada anyway, something we're familiar with, what icebergs are. And of course, one thing that everybody seems to know about icebergs is that most of the iceberg is underneath the water and a very small portion is on top of the water. That was a great problem for the Titanic. But the metaphor I'm building here is that the small bit that you see on top of the water is like innovation. And innovation happens only through this huge body of work and activity, what I call the messiness of creativity, that is beneath the surface. So when I'm talking about creativity, it's really about the use of imaginative skill to transcend the traditional or contemporary, to create valuable or meaningful new stuff, which might be new products, new services, new artistic things, but whatever that means, whatever it is you do in your business or in your practice, it's about creating that stuff that's new, that's valuable, and it's meaningful, in the hopes that at least sometimes those new things would be innovations that would drive value for your organization, for your company.
I'm just gonna, sorry, interrupt you for a second. The slide's not changing for me. I don't know if it's just my view, or I don't know if we're on.
Do you not see a creativity?
Yeah, when we had it up before, it was the full screen, but now I'm seeing like the view with the slide.
Did that change for you now?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, my view is the slide deck on the left, and
yeah,
just the leading creativity in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you click slideshow, top center of your screen should do it.
There we go. It looks
better
good for me now. How's it look for everyone else?
Fabulous. So now you see something that looks like an iceberg, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The right-hand side. Okay, good.
Perfect. Thank you.
So what I was saying about my definition of creativity, or a definition, I suppose, of creativity is the use of imaginative skill to transcend the traditional or the contemporary. So it's all the stuff that happens below that iceberg metaphor surface of the water to create valuable or meaningful new stuff. A couple of things important in that definition or that approach to creativity is that it's imaginative skill. So it is, yes, the use of the imagination, but it's a skill. And if it's a skill, it's something that we learn to do, and it's something that we can learn to do better, which goes back to my earlier point about if there's one thing that you take away, it is that creativity or enhancing it is an intentional activity or requires attention. Key points. So innovation and creativity are therefore interrelated, but I would see them as different. So the creativity is all the processes that may eventually lead to an innovation. Creativity comes first, it's a skill, and as a skill, it needs practice. Now, you can do a lot of creative stuff and not reach an innovation, so that's an issue. So what we'll talk about is how you can perhaps enhance creativity to get to innovations more often. So while it's true that you may be engaged in creative processes and not reach an innovation, it is also true that you won't reach an innovation without the creative processes. So that's why I'm putting the attention on the creative processes. So innovation, and this is, I just wanted to briefly overview 3 types of innovation. I find this helpful even in my own work to think about where is it we're trying to focus creative activity. Are we looking for material innovation as one form of innovation? Are we looking at process innovation? Or are we looking at fundamental innovation, which is the rarest of all forms? So what do I mean by those? Material innovation. Now, normally when I do these talks, I use a lot of artistic examples. So normally I would be talking about American composer John Cage right now and how he put screws and nuts and bolts inside of a piano to change the materiality of a piano as an innovation. However, I did attempt to jump into the tourism world. So a material innovation in the tourism world might look like glamping, right? So it is the changing of the physical product that you're selling to potential customers. And glamping as an innovation, therefore, is the changing of the product or the invention of a new product that will be valuable in a marketplace. So that's what I mean by material innovation. Often it is the incremental or maybe substantial revision of an existing product. Then we've got process innovation. So here I would often talk about John Cage and his use of random chance to compose music rather than the composer making the decisions. But there's lots of process innovation, of course, in tourism as well. Booking.com is perhaps one, and not a new one. But Booking.com and other services like this have innovated the process by which individuals can book hotels and flights and car rentals and all this stuff. You know, we all know this, but that's an example of process innovation. So one of the key questions to ask in your businesses or your organizations when you're thinking about creativity is, where am I focusing it? Am I focusing it more towards material innovation, or am I focusing it more towards process innovation? Or the rarest of all types, which is fundamental innovation. Here I would typically use John Cage's piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is literally a piece of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So there is no intentional sound, which completely undermines the whole notion of what a composer does. So what I mean by fundamental innovation is innovation that challenges or upends the dominant logic, the raison d'etre of a particular industry or sector. I think Airbnb is an example that touches into the tourism space, where Airbnb effectively crowdsources accommodations, kind of upending the dominant logic, which is people go and stay in dedicated hotels or bed and breakfasts that are solely that and don't serve other purposes. Fundamental innovation is obviously the most rare of the 3 forms, the 3 broad types. And fundamental innovation can be a material innovation, and it can be a process innovation, or it can be a combination of the 2. So those are kinds of ways of innovation. If creativity, if one of the key reasons of doing creativity is to reach innovation, then the question becomes, well, how does it that we do that? So here's where I want to talk about individual, group, and organizational levels. And this is really trying to give some structures as well as techniques and tools to enhance creativity in yourselves as individuals and in the individuals in your teams or your groups, but also the group level as well as the organization level. The question I typically ask when I do these kinds of workshops and seminars and courses is, are you more or less creative than a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old? So think of any children in your life, and would you classify yourself as being more or less creative than that child or those children? The general answer to that question is no, I am not as creative as those younger humans. And that's true. By and large, we find creative capacity in adults to be lower than children. The question then is why? So why are kids more creative than most adults? The simple answer to that question is my industry, which is education. We educate the creativity out of you. We do a really good job of doing that because we keep putting you in boxes. There's the math box, there's the physics box, the biology box, and you think about your time going to schools. Schools are fantastic, by the way. I'm not trying to undermine education, but think about your time in schools or indeed in university. You physically went from one box, i.e. a classroom, to physically another classroom, where one you might have studied physics, next one you might have studied biology, and the next one you studied sociology. It's not just education, it's society in general and its culture. So as we get older, what we do is we put up structures in the mind, whether it's through education or through various forms of enculturation, that limit possibility. And we call that bounded rationality. So this is the problem that you as managers or team leaders or business owners, entrepreneurs, this is effectively the problem you need to get around to enhance creativity. Now, I'm saying it's a problem only in the space of creativity and innovation. It is not a problem in general life because bounded rationality is actually really important. So what is bounded rationality? It is the process of dealing with complexity by constructing simple models of reality. It's a means of reducing decision-making calculations by limiting information, alternatives, and focusing on satisfying an acceptable option. Our rationality is bounded or constrained by our experience, education, our cultures, our language, and so on, and the environment in which we exist. Now, it's a lot of fancy words. Let me put it really bluntly. If you didn't have bounded rationality, you would all be still sitting on your beds this morning because you would not have been able to choose what to wear. So if you think about clothing choice, you had an infinite number of choices as to what to wear today. And maybe some of you in remote work are sitting on your bed still, who knows? But you had an infinite number of choices. You could have put on some clothing from your closet. You could have taken saran wrap from the kitchen. You could have put that on. You could have taken the curtains down from your windows. You could have put that on. You could have worn no clothing at all. So there was an infinite number of possibilities. Of course, we couldn't deal with that sitting on the bed in the morning. So our bounded rationality is a very simple example. Provides us, limits complexity, provides us some simple models from which we can then choose. So it limits our options, and then we can make choice through those fewer options. So for me, I put on a sweater, a jacket, and some trousers, and a pair of shoes. I'm also socks and underwear, but that's you can't see those. Bounded rationality, important for being able to carry out daily life. It's important for processes, control, and so on in organizations. But when we enter the space of creativity, it's what we kind of want to get around. And so the question then becomes, how is it that we can get beyond some of that bounded rationality? So the individual level, I think there are three things or three areas to put your attention. I would say this is of creativity at your own individual level, but the individual level creativity of anybody that works in your organization or on your teams. The first bit is just rich, diverse input and experience, getting more stuff into your realm of experience, into your brain, into your mind, into your thinking space. The second is more of a process piece. So when you're approaching a creative problem or a problem that requires creativity, it's using different framing and solving strategies. And then the third element is practice, practice, practice. Going back to my point about creativity being a skill, if we want to do it better, it needs practice, right? So actually spending time doing creative practice, irrespective of whatever challenge or operations you might be working on. So I'm going to speak to each of these three in more specifics, or to give you some actual examples. So in terms of rich, diverse inputs, it's basically asking, how can you get more experience into your head, into your life? How can you get more experience into the lives of your team, your organization, your groups? Streetology, it's a simple, or not a simple, it is a fancy way of talking about walking down the street and observing what's going on. one story I often tell about this is comes from Maytag, which we all know makes washers and dryers. Many years ago, Maytag opened some new product lines. Many years ago, it's probably 20 years ago now. Some new lines in several Asian countries, particularly in remote areas. And what they found was that their washing machines were breaking down a lot more often than they were expected to break down. So what Maytag did was, rather than say, oh, this must be a manufacturing problem, they actually sent a bunch of people to go walk the streets of some of these towns and see how people were using their washers. And what they found was, in a bunch of restaurants and also family settings, people were using Maytag washers to clean vegetables because they needed to clean large quantities of, for example, potatoes. But you can imagine what was happening. Dirt was falling off of them, and then was gumming up the washing machine, and then they were getting all these insurance claims, which was then, or their warranty claims, which was costing them more money. So rather than fix that problem, they saw it as an opportunity and started creating some machines that were more specific to washing vegetables. It opened up a new market for them. So streetology, going out there and observing. Take a MOOC, a massive open online course, or you could take a course from Grenfell campus and Memorial University. Podcasts. I listen to a huge number of very diverse podcasts. Listen to podcasts that are about stuff that you or your team are not familiar with. And then lastly, be a tourist. Travel, see how people, and I don't mean specifically to go on holiday, but be a tourist in other organizations, in other sectors. Get as much experience as you can firsthand through activities like that. And these are just simple ways, and there are a plethora of others, of just getting more rich, diverse inputs into your minds and into the minds of the teams that you work with. Again, it requires intentionality. It requires saying, you know what, we're going to go and walk down that street and observe what's happening in the public, regardless of whatever we're quote unquote supposed to be doing at work. So the second piece here is about multiple framing and solving strategies. And this is really how we go about solving a problem or trying to develop a new opportunity. So some simple tools that I often use and recommend that you use for yourself as well as with your teams. Play the how woulda game. So if you're trying to come up with a new material innovation in tourism, when you sit around that table, ask, how would a medical doctor look at this? How would somebody from France look at this? What would a gerontologist, well, I don't know why I'm stuck in the medical field, but how would a gerontologist think about this? Take a frame of reference that is not your own and ask, what would that frame of reference say, or how would they approach this problem? Another piece is around different processing. We tend to process or try to work through creative processes verbally, either by talking or by writing, right? So typing, writing down, or speaking to one another. Get out of that from time to time and draw creative problems, paint them or dance them. What that allows us to do is access different aspects of our thinking capacities that are limited by verbal communication. So coming up with different ways to process information or think through issues or problems. And the third is just generally ideation through divergent thinking. In organizations, we tend to focus on convergent thinking, meaning we take a bunch of options and then we get to a smaller number as fast as possible, right? So coming from the broad to the specific as quickly as possible. In creative processes, you need to go the opposite direction as much as possible, which is exploding the number of options, the number of ideas on the table. We often do that through processes of brainstorming, which can be effective when they're done properly. However, a proper brainstorming requires a substantial amount of time. So if you've got an issue on the table or a problem on the table or an opportunity on the table, a proper brainstorming session, I would say, is taking your team and saying, okay, you have 20 minutes and here's a huge stack of Post-it notes. Write every single idea that you can possibly think of about that issue or that problem or that opportunity. Down in 20 minutes, you should get hundreds of ideas. Put all those hundreds of ideas up on the wall and put off judgment as long as possible. So you talk through every single one of those ideas, give everyone attention and awareness. It's time consuming, but it's the attention and the time that creativity really does take. And eventually you'll start to see patterns and so on emerging, and then you can start to move from divergent thinking into the convergence. But it's suspending judgment for as long as possible. And the third thing I said was practice, practice, practice. So creativity as a skill requires practice, as any skill does, to develop. So it's good within teams to take time, irrespective of what you're supposed to, quote unquote, be doing, to simply practice creativity. So at the start of a meeting, you take 5 minutes and do the 30 circles exercise, which is really simple. If you've never done it before, you just have a sheet of paper with 30 circles, and everybody around the table has to come up with as many ideas of how to use a circle as possible. So your first circle is a sun, your second circle is a happy face, your third circle is a tire from a car, your fourth circle is a pizza, the fifth circle is, and so on and so forth. So the more you do these activities, the more divergent thinking you'll be able to engage with. X uses of a pen is the same kind of activity. What do we use a pen for? Well, we use a pen for writing, but we can also throw it and use it as a weapon. You can take it apart. You can use it as a straw. So these kinds of exercises are all about loosening up the gray matter, as it were. Stream of consciousness writing is another one. Start with a sentence. Tomorrow I will, and then you just keep writing whatever words and thoughts come to your mind, go down on the paper. Again, these are in the practice section. This is really just about that practice. These exercises shouldn't be focused at this point, if you're practicing, on a key issue problem that you're trying to solve. It's just simply practice and simply loosening up the creative imagination. So that's the individual level. At the group and organization level, it becomes more about process and culture. I've put up a rude cartoon there, but it does depict how creativity is often approached in organizations. So a manager saying to an employee, you go back to your cubicle and start thinking outside the box. Well, nobody's going to think outside the box when they're sitting inside a cubicle, especially if they've been told to just do that by their manager, by their leader, whoever is running the company or the organization. So it's about how do we get beyond those kinds of mindsets in organizations. And for this, I am going to invoke the arts. So I want to show you a short video. It's about 2.5 minutes. And this is a video of the Orpheus Chamber Ensemble. You will note the lack of masks. So this is certainly a pre-COVID video. But what is very cool about the Orpheus Ensemble, it's one of the highest performing musical ensembles, at least in the quote unquote classical world. Highly sought after, very successful recording, performing artists. They are an orchestra, so you'll hear them play a Beethoven or a Mozart symphony, but they do so without a conductor. And that goes to the group and the organizational culture and processes that they've developed to be able to really enhance creativity for innovative outcomes in the organization. So I'm going to play this video, and Nora, if you can give me a thumbs up once the video starts to let me know that you can hear it clearly. Great.
I could hear it, but now I'm not hearing it. I don't know if everyone else is.
The Orpheus model is never boring. The idea of Orpheus is that we take symphonic repertoire, play it with chamber music techniques. And what that means is basically that the musicians take over the role of a conductor.
Each one of us is as responsible as a conductor for having an interpretation, knowing the score, and being able to discuss those ideas with your colleagues. That's something that's very unusual in an orchestra setting.
While it's very exciting, it's also a real challenge to come out with a conclusion and a plan for execution. There needs to be a clear chain of command. You've got to have defined roles, and you really need to create a group consciousness.
It starts out with just the core of players who are the principal players for that particular piece, which is different for every piece. And once that gets developed within the chamber music group, the small group, it's then transferred to the large group. And that's one of the most difficult moments, is to take the small group's concepts and see how it's going to work with the bigger group.
as a whole may sometimes reject some of their ideas, argue, question, deepen. And so every member in the rehearsal process and on stage absolutely has a say.
I'd like to tell a story of when I first played with Orpheus, the very first time. I was very young then, and I'm standing in the doorway very shyly because, as I say, I didn't know anybody. And I see people are laughing, they're telling jokes to each other, people are playing licks for each other, playing things on the violin, just chaos everywhere. And I found that absolutely amazing that we can start from nothing and end up with something that people really want to hear and that we all enjoy so much.
Okay, so Orpheus does things very differently, and what they've chosen to do, or the way that Orpheus works, I would actually call a process innovation in and of itself. So they've gotten rid of the conductor, and this is where I usually, or at least I used to make a joke because I am a conductor, so the Orpheus made me redundant. They got rid of the conductor in favor of enhancing or creating a more creative organization by leveraging each individual, by leveraging teams, and then by creating this culture of creativity within the orchestra. When they got rid of the conductor, of course, there are important things that conductors do, which largely revolves around running rehearsals, developing interpretations of pieces, helping guide the organization into a creative output. So what they do is every single piece, so if they take a Beethoven symphony, a Shostakovich thing, a Brahms, whatever it is, they take a different leadership group, if I can call it that. Each group will be different for every piece. That small group of 5, 6, 7 people, they go off and they learn this piece, they come up with an interpretation, they make all kinds of decisions and suggestions around it. They bring their interpretation back to the whole orchestra, the larger group. Then they effectively teach that interpretation to the group, but they do so in a way that invites everybody else to comment, critique, change, push back, etc., the decisions that the small group has made. Right? So what they're doing all the way along is getting more people involved in the creative process, empowering those people to be involved in that process, and constantly seeking out creative feedback and critique on what's happening. It's a very different way of operating. It is, to be frank, less efficient than having a singular conductor on the podium making the decisions. But the trade-off, so you trade the efficiency off with greater creative outputs. And there's another benefit to doing this. Everybody is more engaged because people feel that responsibility. They feel that creative buy-in. I often think of creativity almost as a drug. It gets people hooked, but people feel that responsibility to contribute because they've created this organizational culture that values creativity in some respects over efficiency. Not to say that they're not efficient. They're just less efficient perhaps than a standard orchestra, or the way orchestras have done things for the last couple of centuries. So that is a little bit on the group level or the organization level. And really what you want to be doing, thinking about leading it at the group level and at the organizational level, is creating processes and structures that support and encourage creative attempts. And I really can't underscore the word attempts enough, because it's not support and encourage creative outcomes or creative successes. Most creative attempts will actually be unsuccessful. But it's the attempts that need the support and the encouragement. It's about increasing member autonomy. So in that Orpheus orchestra example, everybody has the ability and are expected to contribute creatively to the organization. And they've done that by creating these open communication and structures. Those open communication structures also encourage and leverage the diversity that's present in the room. Diversity is a whole other piece that I would often talk about this in a longer session, but diversity is a huge issue within increasing creativity, because we need to be able to have more diversity and then leverage that diversity more, but that's a more complicated discussion than we have time for today. And then the fifth element is, and this is really a function of leadership and management, it is studying the process that your teams and yourself are going through, reflecting on what works, what doesn't work, and adapting them continuously. So at the individual level, I talked about the rich, diverse inputs, and then the multiple framing and solving strategies, and the need to practice. At the group and organizational level, it's about these things that will develop better processes, and then ultimately culture where creativity is expected within the organization. Let me very briefly, I'll take 2 minutes to go through the stages of creative work. I will blast through this very fast. Partly because there's use to this, but I don't like people to get hung up on the stages of creative work, because creativity is not linear. That iceberg, what's below, is very messiness. You can't ever really predict what's going on. But generally, we feel like we are sometimes in stages of preparation, sometimes in stages of incubation, sometimes in stages of illumination, and sometimes in stages of verification. The only two that I will say are predictable, or that are required in a certain sequence, are preparation and verification. By preparation, what I mean is preparing to be in the creative space. So it's about formulating the problem. What is the problem? The example that I gave on the Maytag washer and the vegetable washing, if they had not sent people over to do the streetology piece, somebody sitting in an office or a factory in the United States may have figured, well, this is a manufacturing problem. So they would have actually formulated the problem incorrectly. So you need to spend time formulating the problem. You need to spend a lot of time on ideation. You need to spend a lot of time on search. What are other people in this space doing with this, particular problem, or with this potential opportunity? And also play. It's the idea of dancing, painting, drawing as part of your processes. The incubation phase is simply about waiting. Creativity takes time, patience, trust. I'm sure everybody listening to my voice right now has had the experience. You've got some issue at work and the solution appeared to you in the shower or in the bathtub, not when you're actively engaged with it. So creativity requires you to take time, have patience, trust, and yes, walk away, because the mind will continue to process these things even when you're not actively on it. So it's the incubation phase. This is the one that often gets missed in organizations, because there's this rush or this desire for productivity, for a tangible outcome. Creativity needs more time often. The illumination phase, we know when it happens because you feel it. It's like, that's the idea, or that's the direction, or that's the plan, that's the solution. We feel these as moments of significance. And they're often, I would say almost always, if not always, emotional experiences. You think, we get excited about it. However, they're not always right. So the verification phase is really important, which is about evaluation, testing, critiquing, and judging. Because just because you or your team thinks an idea is brilliant does not mean that the rest of the world is going to do so. So you have to do your market testing and analysis, invite people to critique, and so on. And again, of those four, preparation is predictable. You have to do the preparation. Verification is predictable because you have to do the verification. But how you get from preparation to verification is a bit messy, but you will go through stages of incubation and eventually into illumination on those. But you may find yourself at the verification stage having to go right back to preparation because your idea was tested and shown to not be feasible in the marketplace. So the very brief summary: creativity is a skillful activity that can lead to innovation. Innovation is the successful outcome of creative activity. Primary types of innovation are material, process, and fundamental. For us to reach innovation or successful creative outcomes, it requires good creative work. And to do that, it requires that intentionality of focus from folks like yourselves that run organizations, teams that are entrepreneurs, and so on. So as an organizational or group leader or an entrepreneur, you need to attend to the individual skill level, rich, diverse inputs, multiple framing and solving strategies, as well as ensuring that creativity gets practiced. At the group level, it's about processes, and at the organizational level, it is about enculturating an organization that wants to be creative, that supports creative attempts, open communication and structures, and so on.